now let me move on to the third and sort of major, somewhat emotional theme on judicial activism or judicial adventurism. And this, whilst this theme may have achieved more prominence recently, I think this has been debated really from the last 30 years in different forms as to where really do you draw the lines between the executive, the legislature and the judiciary. And in our constitutional framework, these lines are somewhat fuzzy. So there have been moments when one organ of the state has collapsed or underperformed, the other organ fills in that space. And there's always this controversy that goes on where do we draw that line. As the business community looks at it, I think they ask themselves the question and they ask the system the question, so is there really any place for judicial activism in commercial contracts or in commercial situations? And of course there is no clear line there as well. And I'm going to ask Mr. Vanvati to really initiate the discussion on where do you see the judiciary at this point of time in terms of its activism. How is the debate playing out in the Supreme Court?
Cyril, I find that one of your questions, the first question was, should our constitution allow a watertight separation of powers between the executive and the judiciary? My answer to that is that it's inevitable. The constitution recognizes that there are three branches of the state. Parliament, which enacts the law, the executive, which implements the law, and the judiciary, which does two things. It checks the constitutional validity of every law. Unlike other countries in which there is no such constitutional review of legislation, we have a system under which the courts can declare law to be unconstitutional for violation of fundamental rights or being beyond the powers of the legislature which passes it. So this is something which is accepted. And the judges, when dealing with constitutional challenges to law, have been extremely conservative. They have always tried to support the law. They presume that laws are constitutional. They do not stay laws, and there is no difficulty on that. And that's a fact of life. We have to accept it. You have to accept that the judiciary is going to interpret the law and tell you if you are wrong. You have to correct yourself. The problem arises when it ceases to be constitutional determination of the validity of laws, and we get into a broad supervision of executive action. It started in the 1980s when Justice Chandrachud's father was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, where they considered PILs, public interest litigation, to be something which is an avenue for people who can't access courts. You had people, bonded labor, you had people who had been blinded, persons who are beyond the system. The PIL gave them a chance to approach the courts, and the courts enforced Article 21, the right to life, in its most magnificent form. Over the years, the PIL jurisdiction widened. To a large extent it widened because the executive was not doing its own job. There were certain areas in which, particularly environment, where there were some very difficult decisions to be taken. The courts were actually invited to say, we will not use diesel in Delhi and you will have compressed natural gas for Delhi transport. Difficult decision politically. The courts, when the courts decided that, the administration was very upset. Ultimately, when it was implemented, because of the court orders, they took the credit. So the second aspect of judicial activism was because of executive inaction.
Traditionally, I think judges have made a very clear-cut distinction. In areas involving protection of human rights, in areas involving protection of fundamental freedoms, they are bound to be active in the enforcement of fundamental human rights, particularly because those human rights are asserted on behalf of people to whom the political system doesn't give a voice, because they are really the marginalized. When it comes to economic policy, traditionally, at least that's conventional wisdom for a judge, that you have a high degree of deference on issues of economic policy. And that spills over into areas of commercial law. I think between judicial activism and restraint, every judge really is conscious of the fact that you are bound to apply rule of law standards. In India, there is an additional factor which perhaps in many other common law jurisdictions would not really exist, which is the requirement of constitutional jurisprudence, because you're not really just applying common law rule of law notions, but rule of law notions as now they expound in the context of a written constitution. So you have to apply standards of fairness or justness. There was a beautiful sentence which I came across in a judgment of Justice Matthew in the very famous fundamental rights case which he decided in 1973. He was one of the judges in that case, 13 judges. And he said that most of the things in life that are worth talking about are matters of degree. And the great judges, he said, are those who are most capable of discerning which of the gradations make a genuine difference.
But we do start with the premise that judges don't merely apply or interpret the law as they see it, but there is a space in our constitutional structure where judges can make law as well.
Judges certainly have to interpret the law, and that role of the court as an interpreter of law, you can never take away. I don't think any common law system has really taken away that role of the court as an interpreter of the law. The effort is to promote objectivity and to promote a greater degree of certainty in the application or interpretation of law. The area of law which I think judges have been very active in is where there is no law at all. There is no laid down parameter of law. I'll give you a classic illustration was sexual harassment in the workplace. Absolutely no parameter of law at all. But the judges applied international conventions. Or Chief Justice and I, we were sitting together in a case where a whole lot of children of a home for mentally challenged women, they were sexually abused. Now we have to we had to monitor everything in the case, from the rehabilitation of these girls who were mentally challenged, who were sexually abused, to the investigation of the case, to the proper fair criminal trial, to changing the status of homes for mentally challenged children in the state. So as I said, these are areas perhaps where there is no laid down framework for the guidance of judges, where you're dealing with areas of fundamental freedom.
But there are really sort of two confusing narratives over here, even in this whole space of activism. Is on the one hand, and you look at the mainstream system of justice, so to speak, where a citizen would find the legal system very technical, things like the Limitation Act, your pleadings in the proper format or not, and every rule in the book is sort of thrown against you. But when it comes to the exercise of the writ jurisdiction, or where essentially constitutional rights are being interpreted, the judiciary almost swings exactly to the other extreme. How do you reconcile these two narratives of effectively a state conservative judiciary, and on the other hand, a very sort of vibrant, creative and imaginative judiciary, all essentially from the same system?
The process of constitutional interpretation and constitutional jurisprudence, which was given to Indian courts to evolve and to create new doctrine, as opposed to civil law or criminal law, where I think the ability of which a judge has in terms of pure principles of civil law or criminal law is far more restricted than when you are in an area of virtually uncharted constitutional jurisprudence.
Coming up, is India's judiciary the most activist in the world?
I think India probably is the most activist court I know.
There are ways and ways in which we can conduct the public interest litigations to see that it does not become adversarial, but it does serve public interest.